Hey everybody, CVH here with BetweenTheLanes.net. I get a lot of questions about crafting, whether or not I am streaming or doing videos. A lot of people want to know what my idea is as far as crafting guides, whether or not I should do one for Between the Lanes. A lot of people ask me what the first legendary they should craft is. And if you ever watched my stream when I get asked one of these questions, I usually try to stay away from big sweeping answers because I think everyone is on their own journey and has their own goals as far as their collection and a different budget, of course. So I don't like to say there's one specific path to oh, you should craft all of these epics and legendaries in this specific order. But I did get a pretty good suggestion actually about doing a top 10 craftable epic video from someone on YouTube. And this is the thing, I think this is important because epics are one of the highest investments in the game. They cost 400 soul gems to craft. I know legendaries cost 1200, but you can run 3 of all epics in the game currently, and a lot of the time running 3 copies of a specific epic in your deck is going to lead to more wins than running that one copy of Tazcat even, or even one of the extra copy, a third copy of Bone Colossus isn't going to win as many games as perhaps the 3 epics that you crafted for the same deck. So I think, given how when you craft one of these, you really want to get full value from your investment because there's a lot of subpar ones in constructed. And if you're crafting legendaries, you can research, of course, which are the best for your deck. But it's only going to be a 1-card impact for the price of 3 cards that are epics. And when it comes to commons and rares, they're so low investment that it doesn't really matter if you happen to craft a bad one. They don't really cost too much. So for the sake of this video, I want to give you my idea of 10 epics, going in order of from 10 to 1, of, 1 will be the best, obviously, of things that I consider must-haves. However, obviously not all of these can be played in every single deck because they're going to be of different attributes, and not every deck can play a blue card, for example. So for this list, I've also neglected to include any of these dual attribute epics that you see on screen. I just think that I wanted to give you all a more general idea of things that could go in a wider variety of decks, although a lot of these are inclusions in many decks. For example, you don't want to play a Ram Scout deck without Thorn Mage. But for the purpose of this video, I'll give you these 10 epics that I think, basically, if you're a new player coming into this game or just building up your collection, these I would put an emphasis on having, and it should go without saying, but for example, I wouldn't disenchant any of the ones on this list if you're looking for those extra soul gems to craft a legendary or something. Alright, so number 10 on the list, we have Preserver of the Root. This is one of those cards that squeaked into the list because it's not used in every single endurance deck, like some of the ones higher on the list will be used in almost every single deck of their attribute. But this is a 3-of inclusion in basically every single endurance deck that wants to go past turn 7, as you might be able to infer from the effect here. Obviously, this is a card that has insane value if you actually make it to turn 7, 4-drop, 6/6 guard. So basically, you'll see this in all of the Ramp Scout decks, you'll see this in all of the Control Spell Sword decks. A lot of decks with Endurance actually don't want to go that late currently, but many of them still do. And if you are, this is a card you have to think about whether or not you're actually going to be playing one of those decks. But if you decide to craft one of these decks, this is one of the most high priority epics for you to create. So moving on to number 9. And we have the Leaf Lurker. This is one of the most fantastic little epics in green. It's a summon, destroy a wounded enemy creature. So basically, it's a finish off on a stick. And that matters a lot because a lot of these archer mid-range decks especially want to run Burn and Pillage and Withered Hand Cultist, and Leaf Lurker does not have anti-synergy with them, as finish off does. So this card goes into basically any sort of a deck using agility that doesn't want to end the game very quickly. Prophecy Assassin is one of those aggro decks that doesn't really care about the mid to late game, so it doesn't really run value cards like Leaf Lurker. But as I mentioned with Scout Ramp, this is an instant inclusion in that deck, and it's an instant inclusion in a bunch of mid-rangey green decks, such as the Archer midrange. So definitely, if you're planning on playing any of those, Leaf Lurker, totally a safe card. You're going to want to have 3 of these. Moving on, and you'll find I say that with a lot of the cards in this list. You'll probably want to have 2 to 3 of basically all of them. If you're going to craft one, you probably also want to think about crafting the next couple copies in the near future. So for number 8, we have Earthbone Spinner. I saw this card for the first time when I started playing, and it was definitely one that jumped out on me because Silence is such a powerful effect. This actually isn't going to be the only card on the list with the Silence effect. But yeah, Silence is just extraordinarily powerful, and you can also be dealing 1 damage to creatures. So if they have a Descendant of Alkosh, for example, that was a 1/1 at one point, but has created itself, a million keywords, and now it's 5/5, and it's just beating you down or something, being able to play Earthbone Spinner is not only going to remove all the additional keywords and bring it back down to a 1/1, but since it started out that low, it's also just going to be able to kill it, as opposed, you also have the synergies with cards like other things that deal 1 damage to finish off things like Daring Cutpurse, and you can set up for a Leaf Lurker turn, even if the Silence effect isn't relevant. But silence is one of the most important keywords in the game because you can also get rid of cover of creatures that have been played in your opponent's shadow lane. So if you're playing, I mean, almost every single deck with strength, red, wants to be playing Earthbone Spinner, so definitely a safe card to craft, do not disenchant, all of that stuff. So the next one on this list is sort of one of the more fringe playable ones, sort of like the same vein as Preserver of the Root with a much higher upside. Ice Storm. This card recently got an actual redesign, the art is different now, and if that wasn't enough to convince you to craft 3 copies, it also happens to be probably the best area of effect action in the game, which basically means it affects like a large portion of the board as opposed to a piercing javelin, which just affects one creature on the board. But this, deal 3 damage to all creatures, very self-explanatory. One of the most powerful cards in the Control Mage deck that can, as soon as turn 5 with the Elixir of Magicka or turn 6 rolls around, can start shutting down aggressive strategies. Now, this is definitely far from being played in every single deck that runs Intelligence, but if you're planning on playing any sort of control deck that runs Intelligence, you definitely, absolutely want Ice Storm. However, one of the differences between this card and a lot of the other ones on the list is that you don't necessarily need 3 of them. A lot of the time, control decks only run 2. I mean, having 3 is obviously a plus in case the metagame switches to a point where you do want to run 3. But, you know, just having Ice Storm in general, you're probably going to need it if you're playing an Intelligence control deck, because your opponents, a lot of the time, this is not a card they can just simply play around if they're an aggressive deck. So whether or not they put you on having it, it's not going to make it any easier for you if you decide not to play. You're going to want to have these in your arsenal. So moving on to a card used in a different type of deck entirely is Divine Fervor, coming in at number 6 on my list. The irony is Divine Fervor decks often lose to the decks that use Ice Storm, but Divine Fervor, again, not used in every single willpower deck, but this is definitely the single most important card for any of the token strategies out there, like Token Spellsword, Token Crusader. You will absolutely need even 3 Divine Fervors. This should be the first thing you make sure you have if you're building one of those decks. If you have any sort of leftover Soul Gems, make sure you craft the 3rd copy of this. I know it's tempting to want to craft other things, but if you're playing a token deck, this is really the card that makes it worthwhile. It's easy to underestimate this card, actually, as I first did when I was getting into the game, because it's like 4 Magicka to not really impact the board if you don't already have a board. And while that's true, and you definitely aren't playing this card on curve a whole lot unless you've already set up for it with an insane early progression, with an insane early curve into, like, Elixir into Imperial Reinforcements to set up 4 1/1s in a Divine Fervor. While you're not often doing that, what this really turns into, even at its worst, is a 4 Magicka investment that continues to pay off for the rest of the game because it's a support that's an ongoing. So it just stays on the board the rest of the game and makes your board that much more threatening. So not really, it's like negative tempo when you play it if you don't have a way to take advantage of it, but any sort of time late in the game when you've already played a bunch of things that need that extra push, it can be extra damage, it can be extra power on your guys to help them trade. Definitely a fantastic card for those decks, and a card you're going to need 3 of if you're playing tokens. So moving back into Endurance, we find a card that's played in a lot more decks than even Preserver of the Root. Shadowfen Priest also finds its way into token decks, and can even cap out an aggressive strategy because of its silence being so good. So this is number 5 on our list. This is a card that you find in almost every single control deck, every single ramp deck, as well as, Preserver of the Root was, but this can also find its way into many other decks just because the silence effect is so much more relevant than simply having a guard. A lot of decks that don't need a guard later in the game still need a silence or way to interact with enemy supports. This is one of the most efficient answers, if not the most efficient answer in the game to Divine Fervor, which is not the reason I placed it slightly higher on the list, but it's worth noting. So Shadowfen Priest, definitely a card you're going to want in many Endurance decks. So moving to number 4 on our list, actually, is a card that I personally did underestimate, and I think a lot of people underestimated it because when I first started playing, almost no one was playing it, and now you see it almost everywhere on the ladder. Burn and Pillage. So I think the only deck that runs Strength that doesn't want to play this card currently, that's even moderately aggressive, is the Crusader token deck, which I've seen run Triumphant Jarl and other things over Burn and Pillage, because you're not mindlessly hitting the face as much. You want to set up for your combos. But basically any deck that's aggressive with Strength could benefit from Burn and Pillage. It's an inclusion in almost all the mid-range archer decks you're going to see on the ladder nowadays, and Crusader aggros, Battle Mage aggros. You hit your opponent enough, And then all of a sudden, if they decide that they want to start stabilizing on the board, which they obviously do, you have these like immensely powerful sweepers in your deck. This is one of the most efficient board clears in the game, and it might not look like an aggressive strategy wants to be playing these sweepers, but this really helps you close out the game because you can translate it into extra damage. You're hitting your opponent a lot, but if they stabilize, they can all of a sudden they can just they can answer everything you play. If you play something in the shadow lane, they can silence it and attack it. If you play something in the other lane, it's just going to get attacked. If they set up a guard of like 3 or 4 toughness or health rather, you can't really get by that very easily with an aggressive strategy. So Burn and Pillage not only gets rid of all of those threats that could counter your threats, but it's getting rid of their ability to counter you and close out the game. So by buying you those extra turns, it's actually really increasing the amount of damage your deck can put to their face. So Burn and Pillage, definitely a fantastic card. You probably want at least 2 of these. I don't know if many decks are playing 3, but 2 is definitely a safe thing to make sure you have and not disenchant at that point. So I'm not really going to talk about this next one too much because I did a video analyzing why it's good, but number 3 on our list is Manticore, one of the most powerful epics in the game, definitely one of the most powerful cards in the Control Mage and Control Spellsword decks, and any other control deck that runs Willpower that seems to pop up will probably want to be playing Manticore as a 3 of. Fantastic card. I recommend checking out the video I did on analyzing it to look at why it's fantastic, but a lot of it should be pretty self-explanatory. It's a 2-for-1 removal and a guard all in one. A little bit expensive, but that's the kind of card the decks want to play. So both of the last 2 cards, number 2 and number 1 on our list, are in fact not 7-drops, but they are in agility. And I was wondering why that didn't show up for a minute. Moonlight Werebat comes in at number 2. There's a lot of talk about this card and what I'm going to put at number 1 on the list due to their power level. Moonlight Werebat is actually the only prophecy on this list. But it is probably it's probably the most powerful prophecy creature in the game, at least. I don't know if it's the most powerful prophecy, but this card generates tempo swings and damage swings better than almost any other single prophecy in the game. So if you're playing any sort of an aggressive mirror match, if you're playing aggro against aggro or aggro against midrange or midrange against midrange, getting this card in a rune can single-handedly change the outcome of the game. Because what happens is not only do you get something that can possibly take a favorable trade, but if you're simply even going to put it in an uncontested lane and hit your opponent's face, you're dealing 4 to them and you're gaining 4 life, which is a life disparity of 8, and if it's unchecked, it's a life disparity of 16 on the following turn. It requires them to answer it, which is not always immediately possible, especially in an aggressive deck that might not be running Crushing Blow or Lightning Bolt. If you're playing like a mid-range Archer mirror match, this card will be very hard to answer if you plop it down in a lane that's uncontested, because not much will contest it immediately. This card was underrated a lot when I first started playing, but given the importance of life points in this game currently, a lot of decks really care about it, with cards like Golden Saint, Soul Rest Marshal, Triumphant Jarl being so popular. This card is definitely a must-play in, I think, literally every single deck that runs agility. I noticed Ram Scout playing 2 copies, but basically everything else is playing 3 copies of this card, and I think it's for good reason. Definitely a card you want to get your hands on if you're playing any decks with agility, as is the number 1 on my list, Housekinsmen. The only difference being that I think every single green deck that I've been seeing on the ladder is actually running 3 of these cards. Not really a reason to play 2. This card is much better on curve than the Werebat is, just because it's better stats for the cost. 3/3 for 3 is better than 4/3 for 4. Last Gasp is a life disparity of 6, which, it's a lot of value right there. 3-drop, 3/3 already trades with a bunch of other 3-drops and 2-drops. And this is a card that will punch your opponent for 3 every single turn until they use their own resources to get rid of it, at which point you're dealing 3 to them and gaining 3 health. You can set this up in a lane, attack with it, and then if you fill up the lane and play something else, you can pop your own Kinsman and deal an extra 3. You can do that multiple times a turn if you have enough Kinsman out. It can get pretty obscene. And this is one of the most upsetting cards in a deck like Archer Midrange to play against, because your opponent plays this on 3, and you basically think to yourself, there goes any chance of myself actually getting ahead in life, so we're at the point where they can't actually play Soul Rest Marshal. So not a whole lot of counterplay that this card allows unless they silence it. But as you've seen on the list that we've revealed, Earthbone Spinner and Shadowfen Priest are 2 of the best silences, but it still feels kind of bad to be playing one on a Housekinsman, because there's probably better things in their deck to silence as opposed to just saving yourself 3 life effectively. But this card definitely can be underrated, but I do think this is probably one of the most ubiquitous on the list, and if you're playing any sort of a deck with agility, I recommend picking this up. I recommend picking up basically every legendary, or every epic on this list, actually. I don't know why I said legendary. They do have legendary effects, I think. Housekinsmen and Werebat, they have the power level that you might expect on a legendary card. But these are all definitely fine cards to craft. If you have the extra soul gems lying around, these are 10 epics that I think you're going to want to own if you're moving to a point where you think eventually you're going to have all playable decks. These are 10 epics that you're probably going to want to own. These are 10 that you would probably never disenchant unless you have 4 copies of them. So hopefully this allowed you a slightly easier crafting experience when you're out there buying some packs, whether or not you're on a budget or whatever. I know there's a lot of cards in this game so far, even for just one expansion, so it can be a little daunting. But hopefully this lightened the load somewhat. And if you liked, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on the video itself. Check out betweenthelane.net for more strategy content, and I'll see you guys next time.